Thank you so much to Adi and to Timothy and the whole collective for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be here for the first time and participating in this really incredible collaborative structure. So thank you again. My concern with spontaneity is part of a larger commitment to exploring verbal art as a space for new, not yet available concepts, for thoughts not yet thinkable. The fact that works of literary fiction and poetry are never finished being known renders them answerable, I think, to unforeseen future circumstances, as well as to past and present experiences that have been occluded from view by structures of oppression and domination. My notion of spontaneity first developed out of my readings of Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison in dialogue with Kant's First Critique. And I should just say that spontaneity is not actually a concept. It is really more of a notion or an idea in Kant's system. I can talk about that in the Q&A. Robert Pippin refers to spontaneity as that, quote, enigmatic synonym for thinking in Kant's system. Classically, spontaneity is defined as an action of the mind or will that is not determined by a prior external stimulus. So in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant calls the human faculty of understanding spontaneous to account for the structural creativity of a mind always in excess of its materials. There's a dimension of agency to spontaneity because it means that we aren't wholly determined by the sensory data that we cognize, although we're still answerable to those sensory data. But there's a second dimension to spontaneity, bound up with the first, as Akil has shown, that I'll call the reflexive dimension. And the idea there is that people have an awareness of actively participating in their own cognition. Kant writes, quote, "I exist as an intelligence which is conscious solely of its powers of combination," end quote. So combination is the putting together, he calls it synthesizing, of data in novel ways. So as Hannah Ginsberg recently points out, the consciousness of self turns out to be a consciousness of spontaneity, a consciousness of the agency of putting things together. Now, this reading pushes against the dominant reception of Kantian spontaneity as no more than a cover-up for a rigidly predeterminate view of cognition. So think of the ways in which social categories, for example, carve up meanings into ready-made molds. When Adorno and Horkheimer talk about capitalist markets, and we might add the white supremacist concept of race as pre-stamping the object in advance of perception, they're talking about a situation where the imposition of a cognitive form is a condition of impossibility for genuine experience. So the faculty of understanding on this view is anything but spontaneous. Now, while this critique of Kant might be rightly earned, given the terror and violence so frequently associated with rationality in human history, such a rigid notion of cognition may nevertheless not do justice to all the potentiality embedded in the human understanding. By contrast, as Angela Davis has observed very much in a Kantian tradition, quote, "In art, knowledges that have always eluded conceptual thought can be rendered possible," end quote. What is at stake, I think, for literary authors like Woolf and Morrison is the question whether an affirmative, non-deadening function can still be claimed for the work of conceptualization. So most of my book is on Woolf, but I'm going to focus today mostly on Morrison and give you just one example from Woolf. Woolf's so-called stream of consciousness narration has almost exclusively been recruited for empiricist paradigms of mental association. It's a kind of verisimilitude turned inward. She has that famous quote about sense impressions as the incessant shower of atoms that fall upon the mind and which fiction must try and capture. I'd like to claim, though, that Woolf's experimental novel, The Waves, is illuminating for the philosophy of mind precisely because it does not represent mental contents, but rather is pitched at the level of form. That is, at the spontaneous synthesizing cognitive activities that underlie the construction of objects in experience. Such a spontaneous process requires a type of representation different from naturalistic description, since what is being rendered has not yet taken the form of an object. So I'm going to try to show that a Kantian point about our awareness of spontaneous form, and indeed about spontaneous form as awareness, can be put into dialogue with a stylistic technique central to literary modernism. Let's see if this works. Okay. So here's a passage from The Waves where a group of children engage in a series of totally non-narrative, imaginary speech acts. I call them perception utterances. They're totally impossible to classify. And I don't have time to situate it within the experimental form of the novel at large, but here's just one example. "Look at the tablecloth flying white along the table," said Rhoda. And these are kids. "Now there are rounds of white china and silver streaks beside each plate." The conditions of appearance furnished by Rhoda as a child are mixed, cognitively speaking. Okay, we're presented with everyday objects at different phases of their consolidation by the viewer. Abstraction predominates in the image as variations on two developmentally primary shapes, the line and the circle. The unnamed knives and forks appear as silver streaks. Does that mean that they're still being cognized? Or that, on the contrary, they have been cognized so thoroughly that only abstraction is left? It's ambiguous, right? And yet the round china flanked by these abstracted silver streaks reflects quite an advanced level of empirical perception. The concept goes beyond geometry to incorporate a whole history of British imperialism and table manners. Similarly, separate percepts get cognized as a unified tablecloth only to get caught in motion again, flying white. And notice that the adjective white is used as if it were an adverb. That which is usually static, a description of color, here becomes kinetic. Just as an adverbial dimension of the object is revealed, so too is the adverbial character of thought itself, spontaneity as a way of doing things. By lingering at the level of object construction, Woolf has come up with a new way of narrating the mind, beyond the empirical level of what appears in it, and in doing so, foregrounds what Kant called the mind's spontaneity. Now, I should pause to make it very clear that there is a developmental trajectory implied by Kant's account of spontaneity that should not be ignored. There is no way around the fact that the reception of spontaneity it has often postulated the idea of a pre-spontaneous way of life considered more primitive, the developmental stage notoriously associated with babes and beasts in his system. So the cognitive hierarchies get racialized. And so I'm doing a suspicious reading and a reparative reading of Kant all at the same time here. I'd like to argue that the presentation of consciousness by experimental fiction writers like Woolf and Morrison can move us beyond developmental epistemologies to combat the appropriation of cognitive spontaneity and its dissolution into cliché. These, in different formations, these cliches have attended the reception and perception of jazz improvisation, as well as of literature, skewing, for example, the romantic, spontaneous, poetic expression of emotion and modernist renditions of the vagaries of consciousness. If some of the nuances of Kant's notion of the mind's spontaneity have fallen out of view in its afterlife, the same can be said of the reductive construal of romantic notions of spontaneity tout court, as is most clearly shown in the reception of Wordsworth's theory of poetry. Claudia Brodsky has emphasized that what has come down to us as Wordsworth's famous formulation that, quote, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, is in fact a half quotation. The full statement is, for all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and though this be true, poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on any variety of subjects but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. End quote. As Brodsky notes, the truncated version of Wordsworth's definition has long been the single lens through which his own work is most readily, while disparately, viewed. The result is the limited visibility of the alternative, more nuanced accounts of cognition that are encoded within these artistic practices and trends, from Wordsworth to Morrison. The primitivist and implicitly racist discourse on spontaneity that is so common in Western culture, associating it with the irrational, formless flow of anything goes, does violence to subjectivity as such by excluding from it all structure and epistemic value. Conversely, valorizing spontaneity in art and expression has been used to pit it against theoretical reflection, giving thought itself a bad name by equating it with rigid predetermination, as we saw with Adorno. So I'm actually making the rather bold suggestion that the reductive treatment of Wordsworthian spontaneity and the racist denigration of spontaneity in jazz belong to the same ideological paradigm. And Roland has really pinpointed this yesterday. Fumi Okiji confronts boldly this conceptual double bind when she writes, quote, jazz interpreted as a manifestation of freedom from intellectualized approaches to creative expression is understood by the primitivists to come from a people with direct access to a primal human essence, all but lost by their European counterparts, end quote. That's from Okiji's Jazzist Critique. Indeed, some of the racialized inflections that have accrued around the term spontaneity in the West can be brought to the fore by focusing on jazz improvisation, with improvisation as a cognate term for spontaneity. And here's where I must fully come out as someone for whom jazz is not just an academic field. I'm active professionally as a pianist. The philosophy taught by jazz musicians through and about their art includes the insight that their music performs conceptual work, but in a way that continually contests the divisions between life and thought that have plagued the Western philosophical tradition. Questions about improvisation put to musicians after shows by certain well-meaning listeners can be painful because it would take so much work to undo the presuppositions that inhere in the question, were you improvising when you did that? To say yes would be to capitulate to the primitivist assumption that jazz is a form of unstructured magic, but to say no, I wasn't improvising, would be to give in to the contrary assumption that it's all planned out in advance. According to this logical bind, the music is legible as creation only on the assumption that it is premeditated, a sinister view from which it follows that structured forms by definition are doomed to miss the moment. It is as if something in the colonial tongues and their attendant intellectual cultures through which many Americans speak makes it difficult to specify an intermediary position between a scripted score and the subjective play of anything goes, between fixed structure and arbitrary flow. Indeed, codified musicological discourse in the West, especially when it comes to discussions of Black music, has often had a thinly disguised colonizing function, as Erin alluded to yesterday when she showed those slides of the musicologists trying to grapple with the Kendrick Lamar song. In contrast to these discourses, jazz music shows that one can play, speak, or think in a structured manner in the moment. James Baldwin writes, quote, "Americans are able to admire jazz only to the extent that a protective sentimentality limits their understanding of it," end quote. And saxophonist Gary Bartz, for example, uses the notion of spontaneous composition as a substitute for the tainted term improvisation. I can talk a little bit more about that. Now, for Toni Morrison, that spontaneous dimension by which the mind actively constructs its knowledge is indispensable. Her work suggests that novelistic form can hold or embed non-deterministic, spontaneous ways of knowing that are negated under the reigning social order. Morrison describes the work that her fiction does as a type of inquiry, a knowledge project defined in contradistinction to narrative omniscience. She writes of her 1992 novel Jazz, quote, "I had written novels in which structure was designed to enhance meaning. Here, the structure would equal meaning." So her radical suggestion is that novelistic form doesn't describe, it embodies, and as such, it inquires. In her foreword to the novel Paradise, Morrison writes that, quote, "Whiteness matures and ascends the throne of universalism by maintaining its powers to describe and enforce its description." She says that a feature of white supremacy is that it doesn't produce new knowledge, and actually cites metaphor as a key technique for divesting the English language of its racializing assumptions. I find Morrison's work indispensable for motivating a decolonized philosophy of mind, not based on control or on the presumption of exhaustive knowledge. And she shows the ways in which verbal art can do that. Morrison's critical writings and interviews around the publication of Jazz attest to the crucial role that verbal art plays in the production of knowledge. She states, "Jazz was my attempt to reclaim the era from F. Scott Fitzgerald." Okay, very important. "But it also uses the techniques of jazz, improvisation, listening, to ask questions that I want to ask myself." So Morrison's fiction redresses the co-optation of the jazz age, but she brackets that historiographic corrective as less important than the capacity, quote, "to ask questions that I want to ask myself," end quote. Her narrative process in Jazz generates specific questions then, but also seems to engage the question form itself. And I think it's very important, the specific tie between jazz and inquiry for her. She writes, "Jazz was very complicated because I wanted to re-represent two contradictory things, artifice and improvisation, where you have an artwork planned, thought through, but at the same time appears invented, like jazz. I thought of the image being a book, physically a book, but at the same time it is writing itself, imagining itself, talking, aware of what it is doing. It watches itself think and imagine," end quote. Morrison's image of the book that watches itself think and imagine reanimates the deep and curious links between self-awareness, what Kant called apperception, and spontaneity. Her reflections on jazz get to the heart of the way jazz is constructed and organized as an expression of its spontaneity. Not much jazz music is played in the novel Jazz. Instead, Morrison strips back the cliches that have impeded the registering of subversive sound in the American historical imagination. This is accomplished through her focus on jazz as a formal rather than a thematic model of both composition and epistemology. Stephen Best has shown how Morrison's novel A Mercy radically defamiliarizes the concept of race by returning to a moment in time when the concept was not yet fully consolidated. The novel Jazz may perform a similar function, but begins at a moment when the concept of jazz had not yet been fully appropriated by white markets. The only sustained dramatic situation in which live music occurs is in the Fifth Avenue March scene, a fictional rewriting of the 1917 Negro Silent Protest Parade. This political action, described by James Weldon Johnson in his book Black Manhattan as, quote, one of the strangest and most impressive sights New York has witnessed, end quote, was organized by the NAACP in response to an explosion of violence by a mob of white men and women against Black communities in East St. Louis on July 2nd, 1917. And this was documented courageously by Ida B. Wells. So you can see the photograph, right? Yeah. There are 4 drummers in this image of the 1917 Silent Protest Parade. The 2 drummers in the middle are playing snare drums, with the drummers on either side playing a type of drum called a field drum, which is made of a thicker canvas but still possesses snares. The absence of a bass drum suggests that they were playing in a somber style, but still, this is a silent protest. So a crucial question taken up by Morrison's fictional rewriting becomes, how did the sound of the drums help to constitute this silence? Indeed, we seem to find jazz just where it is nowhere to be found. And I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about James Weldon Johnson's role as the march's sonic architect. So when he's writing Black Manhattan, his attitude as a historian of the march is one of cooperative engagement, not detachment, and he can be seen in the image marching next to W.E.B. Du Bois. The drums, with their deep imbrication with Black epistemologies, serve in Morrison's text as the paradigm for a cognitive act of synthesis that is gestured toward, but never fully realized, in a society where the possibility of thinking things together has been violently foreclosed. Even Morrison, under whose pen language could not have been more vibrant, made it clear that the music steps in where the language of official history fails, the rhythm of the drums taking on the burden of the linguistic. Language, in becoming more like music, becomes itself again. So the Fifth Avenue March is described in Morrison's novel through the eyes of Alice, a character named Alice, who was a church-going, morally conservative woman of the older generation, in charge of the orphaned girl Dorcas, whose parents were murdered during the 1917 massacre. And Alice really struggles to make sense of the sounds she hears. Morrison uses the moment when Alice takes note of the drums to stage an encounter between apparently incommensurable modes of knowing. Here's Morrison. What was possible to say was already in print on a banner that repeated a couple of promises from the Declaration of Independence and waved over the head of its bearer. But what was meant came from the drums, end quote. The modernist adage of the failure of referentiality is clarified and its situatedness renewed by this Afro-modernist musical response to the exhaustion of available language, and specifically to the failure of affirmations like all men are created equal to refer. So a real dialogue with Bonnie's talk here. The banner, and by extension the promises printed on it, wave out of reach, not to be grasped. With this, Morrison not only takes back the era from F. Scott Fitzgerald, but also shows how Black aesthetic and political strategies crystallize the core concerns of international modernism and go beyond them. The agentless syntax in the phrases, what was possible to say, what was meant, itself formally articulates the historical erasure in question, but also paradoxically turns the drums, the indirect object of the sentence, into the conveyor of an intentionality that reaches even beyond the collective towards some impersonal universal. The drums express their knowledge by holding space for the gap between young Dorcas's experience and its available descriptions. Some great gap lunged between the print and the child. Alice glanced between them, struggling for the connection, something to close the distance between the silent, staring child and the slippery, crazy words. Then suddenly, like a rope cast for rescue, the drums spanned the distance, gathering them all up and connected them. End quote. So here's where the drums are making the spontaneous synthesizing happen. The comparison of the drums to a rope cast for rescue suggests that the drums perform the work of spontaneous synthesis, putting the fragments of Dorcas's family story together with the massacre in East St. Louis that is now collectively protested. But the rope is not an arbitrary image. Rather, as metonymy, it evokes via negation the frame of Dorcas's trauma by conjuring the fire truck that never came during the massacre and arson in which her parents were murdered. So a flashback reads a few pages later. A little girl named Dorcas, sleeping across the road with her very best girlfriend, did not hear the fire engine clanging and roaring down the street because when it was called, it didn't come. End quote. This chain of litotes characterizes in great detail the event that did not happen, but should have and could have saved Dorcas's parents had they been living in the white part of town. The drums synesthetically evoke the sight of the rope of rescue, which was never seen, and the clanging that was never heard. This is one way in which the silent march makes experientially present that which did not happen, but should have. Morrison locates in the drums provisionally a power to combine what is disparate without resolving the broken fragments of reality into what Adorno called a false harmony. Drumming in Morrison's novel, associated with the spontaneous action of a protest march, leads to new theorizations where rhythm figures neither as intellectualized activity nor as something unthinking or unthought. And yet, it is no accident that drumming might serve as the leading model for putting it together, in drummer Elvin Jones's terms. In both cases, drumming and the drums are a central and under-acknowledged model for what Kant called judgment, for the acts of mental spontaneity that underlie the possibility of objective knowledge. Now, theoretical discussions of improvisation often center on melodic instruments like the trumpet or saxophone. So it's really important that Morrison's fiction offers an account where rhythm, in particular the drums, the instrument most co-opted by primitivist fantasies, are the prototype for an act of spontaneous cognitive judgment. The unwillingness of Adorno, for example, to recognize rhythm in jazz as a formal innovation and agent of change that is as spontaneous in the genuine sense is something I've discussed elsewhere, but it's definitely in the background here. As we've seen, in Morrison's jazz, the drums are sometimes the only modality available for descriptive truth. This suggests the enduring centrality of Black cultural forms, acknowledged or not, for the future construction of any viable universal categories of the mind. To close, I want to return to the idea that the literary imagination can address truths that are not yet paraphrasable, but rather encoded in novelistic and musical forms, something which now, and perhaps only now, as of the moment of the work's occurrence, becomes expressible, determinate, synthesizable. Literary form can hold or embed modes of spontaneity that are negated in everyday life, either by systems of oppression or because they are lost, submerged so deeply at the a priori level. As a constructive process laid bare in the literary work of art, spontaneous forms carry that knowledge which is always inchoate, that which will be filled in and transformed by the listener, the reader, and by future generations.